She is a published author and a consultant for school districts throughout the country, and she travels across the United States and internationally, speaking at national and regional conferences. It has been very exciting getting to know Katie and working with her and seeing firsthand the changes that she is making in the lives of teachers and students. So I would like to introduce to you Dr. Katherine McKnight, and I'm going to give her the controls right now, and she's going to take you through all her ideas about implementing and listening to children and the building blocks for foundational skills. Katie, welcome.
Okay. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody, trick or treat. A couple days before Halloween, where everybody's pumped up in sugar and excited and all that, right? So I'm really, really glad that you're here, and I want to thank you, too. I realize that many of you have already put in a long day. I'm right now in Anderson, Indiana, working in the school district here, and was in a high school all day today, and in and out of classrooms and whipping up trouble, which is what I like to do most, I think. So we're going to talk about college and career readiness. And I'm sure nobody has heard of that, right, given the current climate. But college and career readiness and what that means, whether you're a state that has adopted Common Core, or if you're a state, like the one that I'm in now in Indiana, they have their own version of college and career readiness. Texas is another kind of notable example. But we're really talking about the same thing of how do we get kids to build in the 21st century so that they can use the information that they have that is so readily available to them in thoughtful, meaningful ways, and for college and career readiness. And then, of course, we're going to talk about literacy centers, and I'm a big fan of literacy centers, what you want to call them. For the younger grades, it might be Daily 5, might consider like a Fountas and Pinnell model of guided reading, or the very classic kind of example of using some kind of variety of like literacy centers or literature circles or something similar to that. But all of those are built on a balanced literacy model, which is the foundation for college and career readiness. We're going to talk about that model, why it's important, what it means to us as teachers. And, just to add to in for my biography too, is that, I got my start over 30 years ago as a middle school English teacher in the Chicago Public Schools. So that's where I started. I started at the age of 16. No, I'm just kidding. But right out of college, and that is, a lot of my experience was in the Chicago Public Schools as a classroom teacher. Now I'm all over the country and seeing all kinds of great things that are happening in classrooms. And then we're going to talk about differentiated instruction too, and what that means. And what I like about the Literacy Center instructional strategy is that we can put, build that on that balanced literacy model, infuse differentiated instruction, and also I might want to add formative assessment, even though I don't have it on my agenda. And then how do we use mini lessons for that targeted instruction, which also can help us too with response to intervention. And then using trade books. What we know over and over and over again, what the research is showing us in reading, is that it really is about practice. And the more pages that kids read, the better they get, period, end of story. That is the common denominator. That is the silver bullet. That's the magic pill. And how do we get kids to read more? By giving them authentic texts that they're going to be interested in and giving them choice in that. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers as well. So hopefully I will be able to give you all of the answers that you need. Now, as I say, I've been at this for 30 years and I'm still trying to figure it out. So I've got lots of ideas though. So when we meet the instructional needs of kids meet the instructional needs of all of our kids in this democratic classroom, it's really rooted in these ideas, these principles, these foundational elements. So balanced literacy, the gradual release of responsibility instructional model, which has been largely popularized recently by the work of Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry. They've really done some fabulous work in writing about the gradual release of responsibility model. But quite honestly, that has its roots all the way back to someone like John Dewey and Marie Montessori. And so this isn't really a new idea. It's what does this idea now look like in the 21st century classroom? And then, of course, differentiated instruction. How do we meet the needs of all of our kids? And so when we look at the balanced literacy model, and Common Core just has 4 strands for ELA, and they're reading, writing, speaking and listening is one, and then language, which includes grammar and vocabulary. But when we look at this one that I have, I've included viewing and presenting as well. And the reason for that is that National Council of Teachers of English recognizes those as language arts and part of that. So that's why I've included it in this model. And then if you look on the outer circles, right, we have balanced literacy, and basically it is this synergetic relationship between all these language arts of speaking, listening, presenting, writing, reading, and viewing. And then they're manifested in all different kinds of pedagogies or instructional models. So, for instance, you might have something like guided reading, which is down here on the lower left-hand corner. That's where we see somebody like Fountas and Pinnell. And then elements of independent reading and finding those just right books. And there's elements of that, of course, within the Daily 5 model. And then we have something like shared reading, which is, echoes from models like Laura Robb's reading workshop, or Smokey Daniels with literature circles. And then we have things like, shared writing, interactive writing, guided writing like 6+1 traits writing, independent writing like a writing workshop model a la Lucy Calkins. All of those ideas are here on that outer model. And so those are all pedagogies and instructional models that have their foundation on this balanced literacy. And the reason why I always show this chart is that when we talk about balanced literacy, there's no one who knows your kids better than you do. The classroom teacher is the best source for finding out what's going on in a classroom. So you may have a classroom, like there's one classroom that I'm working with in Anderson, where we have more of a literature circle model, and then we have another classroom where that's just not working well for us, so we kind of went to more of a reader's workshop kind of model. And so it's in response to different needs that your kids have, and that's one of the reasons why I like the literacy circles model, is because it's malleable. It can be shaped and honed in a way that can be customized for your own classroom. And that's one of the things that I really like about it. And we can emphasize certain things when we need to. There's one school district that I'm working in that has 98% poverty. The average income in the district is about $19,000 or $20,000 per family. I mean, very high poverty. And not surprisingly, what oftentimes goes with that is, the kids are pretty far behind. So one of the things that we really needed to emphasize was making sure that we had strong guided practice for the kids. So they really got a lot of practice, with the skills. And I'm going to show how that worked out in one of our literacy models in a little bit. So when we look at the gradual release of responsibility, it's the I do, we do, you do, I help, and then you do with little or no support. So it's I do, we do, you do. And so when we look at the first part, where we have that demonstration, modeling, observing, that is usually where the mini lesson comes in. So I'm going to demonstrate to kids, maybe through a read aloud or a think aloud, how I approach text, how maybe I annotate text, how maybe I do a character analysis, how I find inferences in a text, how I cite evidence. So I'm going to model that first, probably with a grade level text. Even if the kids are above grade level or below grade level, I'm going to expose them to that kind of text to show them how I think about the text, to be a role model for that. And then the next part is shared demonstration. And that's where kids could work in literacy partners, or we can start doing some center work at that point, where the kids are working together. And then, of course, there's also the guided practice and independent practice, and we would see that more oftentimes in the circles. That's where we're going to get kids to really work on that practice and refinement and that independent practice, and that really starts happening in these centers, okay? So with the college and career readiness, that the new standards are talking about, whether it's Common Core or not, we're all really focused on the same things, and this is really what the professional bodies like National Council of Teachers of English and International Literacy Association, formerly known as International Reading Association, this is what they advocate as well in their policy pieces. And it's really that kids really demonstrate this independence without significant scaffolding, that they can look at complex text, that they can comprehend and evaluate complex text across disciplines. So there's a greater emphasis on content literacy. And those of you who have been around like I have for several decades in the profession, content literacy is not new. But the re-emphasis on it through Common Core and the college and career readiness standards really emphasize how important it is that kids can navigate, for instance, in a science text or a social studies text or ELA and a math text too, for example. Our math textbooks and math word problems tend to be some of our most complex texts that kids encounter. And then that they can construct effective arguments, that they are evidence-based arguments, that it's not the classic 2-year-old toddler says because, and they just, they don't really have any evidence. So it's evidence from text to support a claim. Common Core uses the term claim, which those of us in ELA would say is synonymous with thesis. In science class, we would call it a hypothesis. In math, we would call it a postulate or formulate. And in social studies, too, it would probably be a thesis. But it's all about making a claim. Can you make an assertion, and then can you prove it? And that's a really critical skill. And then, of course, they need to convey intricate or multifaceted information in deepening and independently to discern a speaker's point of view. And that gets at inferential levels of text, because if things are not stated directly, can they figure it out? And then request clarification and ask relevant questions if they know how to question. I've been in a lot of classrooms lately where there's a lot that the kids are not asking as many questions as possibly they could. And I know for me that that's always something that I have to work on to make sure that the kids are asking more questions than I am. And I always have to self-monitor that for myself. What the research shows us, there's been several studies on this, is that the person who talks the most is generally the one who's going to learn the most. So again, literature centers sets the stage where kids can talk to each other about ideas and ask each other questions. And then we need to be able to build on each other's ideas and articulate our own ideas too. And how do we do that? So kids are going to get the most practice with these last three, and confirming that they've been understood. So being able to request clarification, asking questions, building on others' other ideas, asserting our own ideas, and then confirm that we've been understood. That we're going to get a lot of practice with in centers. And that's one of the other beautiful things about centers, is that the kids can start taking the reins of that and ask those questions, assert their ideas, and really just, work in collaborative thinking, which is different than cooperative learning. Cooperative learning, it suggests that there's a consensus on a product or solution. But collaboration are your thinking partners. And so when we talk about, literacy centers and stuff, we're talking largely from this collaborative model. And then we also want kids to comprehend without prompting. So again, if kids are asking their own questions, there's more practice for that. And then demonstrating command of standard English, and that they acquire and use a wide-ranging vocabulary. And it's interesting when I ask colleagues what you think contribute to a text complexity the most. Vocabulary is always learning in those older grades, like 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. There's oftentimes a natural dip. This happens nationally, especially in the middle school grades of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, is that there's usually a natural decline in reading achievement. And a lot of that is rooted into the fact that the vocabulary gets so much more complex, and our texts get more complex. So what does a kid do when they get stuck on a word? How do they manage that? And then more broadly, they become the self-directed learner, and they effectively seek out and use resources to assist them, including teachers, peers, and print and digital and reference material. So one of my wonderful colleagues and mentors. Donna Ogle, who was one of the pioneers with content literacy, and you may know the name. She's actually quite well known in our field in reading. She would often say, the trick is not so much teaching the kids the strategies. It's when the kids know when and how and when to use the strategy. That's when we've really gotten to the sweet spot. So, and that's where that self-directed learner comes in. So they practice those strategies and they know, when do I need to annotate text? When do I need to use sticky notes, for example, as a strategy? And when kids know when to do that, we are pretty sassy as teachers. We have really just gotten there. So how do we get from here to there? And the way that you're going to see this, these are the building blocks for the center model that I'm going to present to you, and also using Sadlier materials, is that it always starts with a great question, and particularly with those older kids. You know, it's got to answer the question of so what. It's got to matter in some way. So there's got to be a juicy question there. And in the olden days, when I was a baby teacher in the late 80s, we used to call that the hook, or the anchor, to get kids into the instruction. So we have an essential question, and then mini lessons, and mini lessons were made, were very much popularized by the work of Nancy Atwell and Linda Reef, and but those are short lessons. They're about 10 minutes, and really addressing a specific point of concentration, skill to be developed. And then centers and how we can embed and infuse large group and small group instruction, and the importance of using trade books. I can't emphasize that enough. Oftentimes what I see with trade books is that schools will have a textbook series and they come with leveled text. And the kids aren't interested in reading the leveled text because they're not authentic. They're not things that kids would be interested in reading. And they're usually like contracted kinds of text, and I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. I don't want to call out any specific publishers, but they just don't work. The kids just don't get interested in it. But if I have books like Wander, well, Captain Underpants for the real little ones, Charlotte's Web, you guys also probably know some things that are really popular in the middle school. The boys really like Ender's Game right now, and Maze Runner, and sports books by Mike Lapisa. I have kids that I'm working with right now that have very little interest in reading, and they're just consuming books now because they reflect them and they're about issues and things that interest them. So I cannot emphasize enough how important trade books are, and I'm not the first one who's proselytized that. There's many other people in our field that have. And then the idea of assessment too. And how do we use formative assessment, those checks for understanding as well. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to look at a 4th grade model, and we're going to look at a 7th grade model. So the 4th grade model is looking at those Common Core Progress, which is Sadlier's publication, and then trade books. And then how do we use centers with Just Right books, those trade books, and then also use vocabulary workshop from Sadlier, and then also grammar workshop or grammar for writing, depending on the grade level. So here's our 4th grade unit. In Common Core Progress, in Unit 3, the content is about erosion and earth-changing landscape, and layers and plate tectonics. So the trade books that we're going to use, these are all informational texts. One on erosion. This one in particular, the one that looks like a graphic organizer, is learning about rocks, weathering, and erosion. And it's a whole book of graphic organizers and stuff that shows all of these different phenomena through visuals and graphic organizers. And I really like that because it was just another way of presenting that kind of information. And then the other text that we have there is Earth Shifting Surface. And then we're going to use Vocabulary Workshop Unit 6, and then we're also going to use Grammar Workshop. And there's a plug for my Graphic Organizer, Book 2, grades 5 through 12. For the 4th grade teachers out there, I do have one, too, that's 1st through 4th grade, too. So there's tons and tons of graphic organizers in there. I'm a big fan of graphic organizers. That just, you know, there's so much about that visual representation, and it's based on John Hattie's work. How key that non-linguistic representation really works is key. So when we look at the Sadlier Common Core Progress, they've got this nifty little progress check on the bottom here, where you can check for understanding. And really, this is one of the tenets of formative assessment. You can do kind of a pre-assessment with the kids and figure out, hey, where are the kids as far as these different skills? And these have to do quite a bit with informational text. And actually, I'm working with some teachers in New Mexico, and we were looking at this and we're planning centers and things like that. And what they noticed right away, and a similar thing has happened to me too in Indiana and California when I've showed colleagues this material, is they notice right away that it aligns with if they're using a calendar or topics or pacing guide, whatever your district calls it, you know, where the kids should be at a given time. This is really helpful, and largely because it's aligned with Common Core, and since we're all kind of using some variation of that it really fit in nicely. The teachers in New Mexico were actually particularly excited about it because they could see right where it fits in with their, they call them simple goals and complex goals, so because they use standards-based grading. So then we have an essential question, and the essential question is, how can readers use details to find the main idea in an informational text? Okay, so then through the mini lesson, and one of the things that Common Core Progress has is that there's, this is the teacher's edition, is that there's really great coaching tips that are on the left-hand side that show, you know, how you can read the selection model and teach, and the kids can follow along in their book, and how you can point out information and how you're thinking about, you know, what's the assertion of the text or the main idea, and how do you cite that. So you take the kids through this read aloud, think aloud, where you can model and teach, you know, read the selection with the kids, and they can follow along in their book, and you're also exposing them to the grade level text. So I always say this kind of facetiously, you know, it's like, oh yeah, everybody's, you know, every kid in every teacher's class reads on the same level, right? Well, of course not. So if we use this as a model, then when the kids are in their just right text, they can practice the skill that they've learned in this mini lesson in their just right book. And we know how important practice is for kids. The more kids practice a skill, the more likely they are to internalize it, that it becomes innate. And I think it was actually Dick Allington had a study that came out last year that was, you know, talking about it more and more and more, how critical that practice time is, and that kids don't get enough time practicing their skills and reading in school. And a lot of that, too, is that we're all under the pressure cooker, too, right, of just, you know, there's more and more and more that we have to do in the precious amount of school time that we have. So anyway, so going back to this, you know, you go through the read aloud, the think aloud, and you show how, you know, you cite evidence and such. Okay, so that's the mini lesson. And this is just a sample for you of centers. And I've seen many teachers do variations of this. So when we do future webinars about the centers and the work that I'm doing in different schools, you know, with Common Core Progress and vocabulary workshop and grammar workshop, you're going to see how teachers have made variations on this model based on their context and what their kids need. But generally, I like to start with these 6 centers. So we'll have some kind of vocabulary activity. And in this model, we're going to use vocabulary workshop. And then the reading strategy mirrors what we had just done in the mini lesson, but then the kids practice in their Just Right book. And each one of these trade books that I selected has a different level of text complexity. I just want to remind everybody to, not saying Lexile. Remember, Lexile is part of the text complexity model, 1/3 of that. And then we go into then we go into content study. I kind of went through that very quickly, where, you know, we're going into the content of like plate tectonics and erosion and such. And then practice with content, we're actually going to pull something from grammar workshop, and then listening and viewing center, and then the teacher-led center. And that teacher-led center, let me go back to that, is an opportunity for us that, and it's similar to the idea that's in Daily 5 model, where you have a teacher-led center. And those kids that need like additional instruction or they need more support, you can meet with them first in that teacher-led center and give them more support. It's also an opportunity to get those interventions accomplished too if you're using an RTI model in your school. So that teacher-led center is where I am as the teacher, and students come in small groups, and I work with them individually or work with them as a group, as a small group. Okay, so let's look at that vocabulary center. So that vocabulary center, what we're going to do there is that we pulled this from vocabulary workshop. And since the erosion text that was in Common Core Progress has a lot of affixes, so we thought that that would pair well nicely with this. So in the next text, you'll see that there's word studies and such with the different affixes, prefixes, suffixes, and then actually going back into the text, we can see how some of those affixes are used too in those in the actual text. So that's a way that we can bridge what was in vocabulary workshop in here. So for instance, like weathering, we have the affix of ing, the suffix, and then shun for erosion and shun for formation. So we already see within that text, bringing them back to them, like, wow, see that there's these affixes in action here in the text that we just read, and bringing them back to that so we can contextualize it. And then the reading strategy, we're going to use those just right texts that have various levels of text complexity, and they're going to basically mirror what we had just done in the mini lesson of finding the assertion in the text, the main idea, and finding evidence to support that. And they're practicing that in a just right book. And I really want to emphasize too, as we talk about just right books, is that nothing is more important than choice. Choice supersedes everything. So even if a kid picks something that's at a higher lexile level, let them go with it. One of the things that I'm a little frustrated with right now is that there's programs out there where kids are only allowed to read books that are in their lexile level. And I want to bring you back, I mean, that's probably a whole nother webinar we could do just on text complexity. But lexile is only 1/3 of the model. It really just gets into decoding. And I'm sure many, 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 many of you have experiences just like I have in classrooms where kids will, quote unquote, read across a text. They can decode it, and then you ask them what's going on in the text, and they have great difficulty with the comprehension of it. So lexile gets at decoding. And then text complexity also talks about qualitative dimensions, which is our background knowledge, also the text structure, poetry versus prose, informational text versus literature, and also text structures, and also your background knowledge too and vocabulary. And then reader and task considerations is when we get to choice. Choice is highly motivating for kids. And as I say, we never take choice away because it really just adds to that motivational factor for kids. And there's actually, I've been reading several articles on it about choice. I know that International Literacy Association and National Council of Teachers of English have featured articles about choice in the last couple of months. Okay, so going back, content area, Content Study Center, we decided to, again, pull from Grammar Workshop, that resource, and we're working on action verbs because a lot of the verbs and some of the vocabulary that was in that text about erosion and earth layers had to deal with action verbs of, things like weathering and such. So we thought that this would be a good pairing with that and do more on action verbs with the kids. And then practice with the content is, again, what Common Core Progress has is that there are comprehension checks and extensions and discussion skills, you can see down here on the bottom, where the kids can go back to the text again from the mini lesson, and they can have discussions. What you said makes me wonder if, and they can do the also this comprehension check together. And then that can also be, too, something that they can do in the teacher-led center. You can piggyback that on. The right around, too, that's a featured element, too, in the Common Core Progress. So, again, that's another way that they can practice with the information that they're getting about plate tectonics and the Earth's surface and erosion. So we're not just working on the literacy skills, but we're also working on the content. And that's one of the things with with the movement with Common Core and the college and career readiness standards is that content, a lot of folks are saying, oh, when are we going to teach content? Well, of course you're going to teach content. Content is the vehicle, though, for developing these skills. So developing our ability to cite evidence and to make arguments that have evidence that are from text and such. So we're practicing our skills while we are learning the content. Okay. All right. So now we're going to go over to the Listening and Viewing Center. And every time I see this picture, it just makes me smile. I mean, Laura's heard me say it a couple of times, just like these two are just so adorable. I can't take it. Anyway, so this is just a crash course. I just pulled it off of YouTube and science, and it's about erosion. And it's a simple video on that the kids can listen and about erosion and Earth's surface. So one more way for them to get information. Another option, too, is that within vocabulary workshops, there's all kinds of games and things like that the kids can use from the word list that, again, that they can play and manipulate the vocabulary. So that's another option as well. So we put, two different things in there. The kids could choose there, or you decide what you want your kids to do at that center, if you want it more content-based, or you want to use maybe, for instance, all the materials that are on Sadly or Connect. Okay, so let's go to 7th grade. Let's give a shout out for the 7th grade teachers. And again, the 7th grade students. And here are the focus standards up here. Those are all the Common Core standards. I failed to mention that on the last example. And then the materials that we're going to use for this one are, again, Common Core Progress, and we're taking Unit 1. And it is the story of Theseus and Minotaur, the classic Greek myth. And then for trade books, we chose all kind of mythology-based text. So we chose Lightning Thief, Poseidon Earthshaker, which is actually a graphic novel. And I want to give a shout out for graphic novels. Graphic novels are awesome. They're particularly great for struggling readers, and they're also really great for kids whose first language is not English. All the visuals really, really help them a lot. Cannot say enough good things about graphic novels. And then The Red Pyramid, which is also by Rick Riordan, and that's his Egyptian mythology series. And then Vocabulary Workshop, and then Grammar for Writing, and then again, my shameless plug for my graphic organizer book. So similar to the 4th grade structure, it's structured the same way. We can use this progress check and check to see, where kids feel that they are at the beginning of the unit and then after the unit, so it's a check for understanding. And again, we're going to take an essential question, and then how do authors use literary details to create text? Or another question we could add to that too, because this is a very knowledge-based question, and more affective kind of one is, why are some stories more interesting than others, or why are some stories better than others, is another one, and that gets at the affective, emotive kind of side to it, which of course 7th graders are all about emotions, right? So here's the story, here's the Greek myth about Theseus and Minotaur. And so again, we would do this in a close reading with the kids as a mini lesson. And the idea of this one is we're looking for key ideas and details. That's the thrust of this lesson. And there's also a comprehension check at the end where the kids can check, how well that they understand the actual story. So we can do that in large group. That's the I do part of that Gradual Release of Responsibility model, where they see how I think about a text. And similar to the 4th grade, we're going to have our 6 centers. So we're going to have vocabulary, and then we're going to have reading, working on that same skill that we learned in the mini lesson, but working with our just right text, and that's the one that kids choose. And then content study, and we're going to look at the genre of Greek mythology or mythology. And then grammar, we're actually going to set up to do a comparison about heroes and how they were represented in Theseus and Minotaur, and then with our just right text. And then listening or viewing center. And then there's going to be a teacher-led center as well. And I'm going to talk about that because we took a little different spin on it for this one. So for the vocabulary, we looked up it actually turned out to be Unit 1 as well, and Vocabulary Workshop with Greek and Latin affixes. And because again, since we're looking at mythology and such, of tying that together that way. And within Sadly or Connect, in the online portion, there are also additional materials that are in there as well. So the kids can also use that if you're fortunate enough that you have Chromebooks, iPads, things like that. They can also use these materials as well. And then again, looking at word structure, Greek and Latin roots, it's not just myths that the Greeks gave us, but we also have so much of our language in English has Greek and Latin foundations. And then there's also wonderful games that are in there. And one of the things that, especially with the teachers of the upper grades that I work with, get particularly excited about this, is that the games also work for older level kids. A lot of the stuff that we see, like with Spelling City, which is, I'm sure a lot of you, especially with the younger grades have used, is more suitable for those levels and such. But this you can use with the upper grades. So it's rigorous enough for that. So yay. Okay, and then there's a matching game. And then the reading strategy, they would take their just right text and take an assertion and cite the evidence from their text that they're reading together as a group. And remember, choice always wins. One of the other things, too, about choice is kids generally, like overwhelmingly, like more than 90% of the time, they will pick texts that are just right for them. It's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Goldilocks is not going to pick porridge that's too hot or too cold. She wants it just right. And kids tend to do that with their reading. That's not to say that you aren't going to have the kid who is reading on the 10th grade level in 5th grade who decides that they want to read Pat the Bunny. You're always going to have that kid, and you're going to try and get away with something. But that's, of course, they're just trying to draw attention. So we have that conversation with them and say, dude, I know that Red Pyramid is probably more, interesting or whatever than reading Pat the Bunny. And, of course, I say that with all the sarcasm and facetiousness that I possibly can. But we know that kid and how they can be. Bless their hearts, right? And then conversely, you might have a kid whose Lexile, scores a little bit lower, and they're willing to take on something that's like 150, 200 Lexile points higher. And my advice over and over and over again is let them do it, because their partners in their group they will be working on that text together. They will help each other through it. And then you can also do things like audio support to support that student who's working at a higher level. So that kind of stretch is awesome. So I would never discourage a kid to not choose, to choose a book because it might be too hard for them. I just cheer them on. So in the Content Study Center, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the characteristics of myth: heroes, non-humans, gods, goddesses, plot, problem. So the structure of myth and how your just right text has embodies those elements of mythology. So that's what kids would be doing in their group in that content study. And then the practice with content, what we chose was something from Grammar for Writing that takes two texts for comparison. So when we look at this mind map here, where it says Big Challenge, what we would do with the kids is that they would choose how a hero is defined. And they would use Theseus and Minotaur. That was our text that we used for the mini lessons, the whole class. And then they would use their just right text and do a comparison between those two texts about how heroes are portrayed and how mythological heroes are portrayed. Now, in this one, we decided, this is a pretty big cognitive leap for most 7th graders that I know. So we thought that this should definitely be something where the teacher's providing support and giving them guided practice through it. And the kids are going to continue to organize their paper and citing evidence from the text in order to compare these two heroes using that Grammar for Writing lesson as a template, as a guide. And that would get them ready too, if you wanted them to do like a final paper, comparing heroes from each of these texts, then they would be poised to do that. The other thing too is that, even when kids like practice drafting a plan for writing, I always advocate that the kids don't have to write every single thing. Remember, we want them to develop a thinking process.
we want them to be able to make an assertion, to make a claim, and then be able to cite evidence. So the more practice they get at doing that, of here's my claim, and here's my proof, and here's my evidence, and they don't necessarily have to write out a full-blown essay for that. If they just did the graphic organizer on this and said how they were going to go about, what their plan would be, that might be fine in some cases, and then in other cases we may want them to write out a full paper on it. So, I just want to bring that out there too. We do want kids to write as much as we possibly can get them to, but I also want them to engage and practice the thinking process over and over and over again, so they really develop this automaticity that when I make an assertion, whether it's called a thesis or whether it's called a hypothesis, that I have evidence to support that, and I can present that evidence either verbally or I can present it in written form. And then the Listening and Viewing Center, again, I just went over to the delights of YouTube and found a 3.5-minute video on the ancient Greeks. And then this is a classic kind of activity of ask something, say something. And so the kids can view the text and they can make a prediction about the Greeks or clarify something that you now understand, something that you know about the ancient Greeks that you didn't know before. Make a connection, ask a question, make a comment, or form an argument. Was the Greek idea of democracy superior to the American? That's a pretty sophisticated one for 7th graders, but something like that. And yeah, so at that point, and again, I want to point out too with the teacher-led group, along the way you can always add in that formative assessment. I always like to use that teacher-led center too as a way to assess and to check for understanding. And one of the tenets of formative assessment is once you get that information, you know how your kids are doing, that you adjust instruction as needed. And my argument all the time, and I say this over and over and over again with the colleagues that I work with, is that if you're doing centers like this, it does seem like a lot of work, and I'm not going to lie to you and say that it isn't, because there is a substantial amount of prepping and planning with it. However, whenever we go to anything new, whether we're teaching a new grade or new subject or curriculum changes, it's always going to add more prep time. What's going to save you as far as time is that really all the assessment should be done on the spot within the centers. It really should just happen in the moment, and your goal should be not to take any papers home to grade. And I know there's like a 12-step for that too, to get us to not take papers home. But if they're working in centers and you're really monitoring, how kids are doing and how they're performing within that, and giving them that on-the-spot feedback, those are two tenets of formative assessment, and we just know that that assessment, too, is also more effective when we can give on-the-spot feedback. And when you have a teacher-led center and you can do that, then you're not taking the papers home. You're giving kids more productive feedback, and you're knowing in the moment how your kids are performing. So, so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laura, and then I think we have some time to take some questions and such. It's a lot of information that I just shared with you. So hopefully it'll be the beginning of many conversations that we have.
Thank you so much, Katie. This has been fantastic. One more back. I want everyone to remind everyone that they have a question box at the right hand of your screen in the control panel. And if you would like to ask Katie a question about a particular area that she presented, Katie, you've shared a lot of ideas with us, and all very
a lot in there. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But you know what? We could all sit around the table and talk for hours, I'm sure. This is just great stuff. I do have a couple of questions already, so don't let that hinder anybody else for typing in the questions and asking. Our first one is, what do you recommend the number of centers for grades, say, 6, 7, and 8?
Okay, so it really depends on the number of students. So when I say 6 centers, this is one of the things that I like about the model and why it seems to be working for me, because I have been doing centers a lot in 5th grade through 12th grade, even in high school putting it in. And you should see the high school teachers. They think I'm nuts when I start talking to them about centers. But I built that model on the idea of about 25 kids. Each group should have about 3 to 5 kids. So there's some classrooms that I've been in where there could be 40 kids in a class, and there's other classrooms I've been in where there's only 15. So think about the number of students that you have and divide it by about 3 or 5, and that's about how many centers you should have. And so one of the things is that, you could drop out vocabulary and just decide, hey, I'm just not going to do vocabulary today. Or we've already done a lot on content, so I'm going to drop that one out today. Or I really need to have them watch this historical video, so I'm going to have them there. Now, the other thing that you can do, too, for those jumbo classes, so if there's like, I've worked in classrooms where there's 40 kids in a class. I'm not joking. And I'm sure there's somebody out there on the webinar who's got a class that size. And if you divide that by 5, right, we're talking of 8 centers. That's a lot of prep. So the other recommendation that I make to folks is that you can double up. So you have basically 2 grocery lines. So let's say I do my mini lesson on citing evidence, and then I have duplicates. So I have kids working on citing evidence in their just right text, then they have vocabulary, and then they have practicing with content. But it's the same center, but I have 2 copies. I have a carbon copy of it. So I have 2 grocery lines that the kids are going through. That also works, too, if you have like a 45-minute to 50-minute class period. Centers generally, and I was negligent to say this, centers should be about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes, depending on the age of your kids. The attention span of kids, the current formula is your chronological age times 1. So if you have 13-year-olds in 8th grade, 13 minutes is about the threshold. But I also give the caveat that still, you know better than anybody else. But if a center is like 15, 20 minutes long, it's generally too long. And then with the younger kids, if it's 10 minutes, it should probably be about 9 minutes because that's the threshold.
Wow, that's really helpful for a lot of teachers, I'm sure. Thank you. So here's a question about the trade books. How do you choose trade books? Are they available through Sadly, or no, we don't have trade books, but Katie will answer this question. Is there a recommended list? So before you answer this question, Katie, I just want to mention that what I can do is send everyone who's attended this webinar a correlated list of trade books to our progress series. So what that means is there's a group of trade books that we have identified by theme that will be helpful when you go through our program progress. So that I can do, and I'll send you an email right after this webinar. But Katie, so is there a recommended list for other, just trade books, no matter what program you're using?
Yeah, well, so for trade books, okay, so you'll see in the lower right-hand corner that, Chapters Group, they've been working with Sadlier, and I work with them too. And they provide trade books. They're a company, that schools can go to purchase trade books. And I love recommending them to schools that I work with because they're just a great company to deal with. So, really good rates and free shipping. So that's kind of that plug. But, as teachers, we're always looking for that, right? How can I get the best deal? Because resources are always difficult. One of the things that Chapters Group did was created this correlated list for Sadlier. And they worked very hard to make sure that they used the text complexity model, that they weren't just using Lexile, because I had consulted with them on those lists. And a lot of times what you'll see lists that just have Lexile. And again, I'm going to bring that caveat, is that, we can't just depend on Lexile. Captain Underpants and Twilight have the same Lexile score. Okay, so that's one example of why you can't just depend on Lexile. My personal favorite is 50 Shades of Grey, has the same Lexile level as Charlotte's Web. Okay, so Lexile just gets at decoding. So the nice thing about the Chapters Group
correlated list that Laura's going to send out is that it really uses the text complexity model. Now, with that said, there are other places that you can go that show kind of models with that based on topics. Engage New York has quite a few book lists that they have that show the various text complexity models and such. So that's another resource for you as well. And the way that I figure it out is oftentimes I just go onto a book search and I start looking for different books. And interestingly, that's one of the things that we're working on this year. I have the opportunity to work with teachers in several states, and we're working on this model with Sadlier's curriculum materials, with their materials, and with the trade books. And we've already started adding books to that list. So the list that we have now that's correlated with the Sadlier units, Common Core Progress, is going to be growing this year. And a lot of the teachers who are involved in the project are going to be joining me on the webinars because, you know, quite frankly, as professionals, we learn best from each other and how we problem solve things. So a lot of the books that are on that list are ones that other teachers have recommended, ones that I've come across, and you know that kids are interested in and willing, you know, interested in reading. So that's always the thing. You'll never keep up with the list. You'll never keep up with all the stuff that's published. But yeah, we're going to be adding along. So I guess that's the quick and very long version to that question.
That's great, though. It answered it. Here's another one for you. How many days a week for centers, or is it just every day?
I know teachers who do them every day. I know teachers who do them twice a week. I know teachers who do them 3 days a week. It's going to depend. But it's like anything else. It's like, you know, fish and guests in your house, they begin to smell after a few days, right? So I always believe in being eclectic in practice, and so it's one more pedagogical tool that you can use. The thing I like about literacy centers is that we can get the differentiated instruction, the RTI, and give kids the practice that they need in building independence. I have really seen classrooms transform, and have been very, very lucky to be part of efforts in different schools and districts where we're just able to raise the achievement rates, and it really has to do with the fact that the kids are practicing skills. For me, I would say probably 2 to 3 days a week, but different teachers do them different ways, and I don't want you to think that there's a way of doing it. And I also know teachers who do them almost every single day.
Yes, I've seen that too. So here's an interesting question targeted on grammar. How do you do grammar centers, or just in general? It seems to be a tough component to get in there if my kids don't have the background knowledge. Unfortunately, when they come to me in 6th grade, they don't know much. That's sad.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of things on that. You know, grammar is one of those beasts that it always continues to vex me as well. And that, you know, I think you don't have to do a reading lesson as your mini lesson. That was just the exemplar that we used today. You might have a grammar lesson as your mini lesson, and then the kids mirror that in the grammar center. So you can definitely do that, or you might do that as a teacher-led center. Or let's say that you've been teaching about verbs and you need to go back and give them more practice on, you know, something like linking verbs. And so you could also be recursive in that as well. There's also tons and tons and tons of videos that are online that teach different grammar points too. And then the other thing too is I've actually written a book on teaching grammar. It's called Hands-On Grammar, and you can get it on Amazon. I self-published it, but it's basically 50 kinesthetic lessons for teaching grammar. So I believe in using manipulatives and making things as kinesthetic as possible. So there's like cutouts, puzzles, things like that. And you know, I keep the book like as inexpensive as I can because you know, like me as a teacher, I'm constantly spending my own money to get materials. But you can get it on Amazon and just look up Katherine McKnight, Hands-on Grammar. And a lot of those grammar lessons you could use as in addition, with Sadlier's grammar workshop, you could use those for centers.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. There have been a couple of questions on, the time, how long, and you've answered them. So I don't want people to think that I'm not, just because I'm not reading their question. Hopefully, we have explained the time and how often, the frequency of centers. How often would you recommend having centers for English language learners, and is that different than your regular population?
Yeah, what a great question. Yeah, just a plug too. My mom was a Chicago public school teacher for 40 years, and she was a ELL teacher back in the day when it was called TEFL. So that's one of those areas that they keep changing the name. With our ELL kids, they're like other kids in the sense of they need practice with those language skills as much as we can possibly give them. One of the things that I would do in particular for ELL kids is also give them a lot of audio support, so that listening and viewing center, it's not to say that it isn't important in a non-ELL population, but giving them much more opportunity to listen and speak the language. That's another reason why I like centers too for ELL population, because they're practicing in small groups those language skills. And oftentimes kids, ELL students whose first language is not English, and also kids with special needs, when we go to a centers model and I interview them and talk to them, one of the things that they most commonly say to me is, I feel safer when I'm in a small group. I'm not worried about making mistakes and looking foolish. And that's particularly critical with older kids and when they're in middle school. But to get back to your question, again, there is no one who is more knowledgeable than you. And so with an ELL population, I would say like 3 to 4 times a week would probably be a good, kind of guideline for that. Because we have to make sure that the kids get as much practice as we can possibly give them for their language skills. The other thing I want to add too is that if you go to my website, KatherineMcKnight.com, I have on there all kinds of resources for centers. So things that I've developed, they're posters and things like that of different activities that you can do in centers. And they're really geared more towards older kids, for 4th grade and up. And I do work in primary, but my sweet spot is the older grades. So there's a lot of materials on there, and also a PDF version of the grammar book too is on there too as well. So if you want to go over there, there's lots of resources on there as well.
So thank you so much for that. I'm sure people will love to come and visit. We are out of questions right now, which is I'm sure that there are a lot more swimming around in people's heads, but right now we're going to end the webinar, Katie, and I do want to invite people to visit the Sadlier site. It's a bit of a lengthy URL, but it is at www.sadlier.com/school/English-language-arts/progress-ELA-webinars. If you go to sadlierschool.com, you'll be able to find it, and if not, you can contact me. But the 2 webinars that Katie has presented, this webinar for grades 4 to 8 and one that was previously recorded, are going to be posted as on-demand webinars on this website. So please go there in the next day or two. You can go there right now for the grade K3, but in the next day or two we will be posting the 4-8 webinar, this webinar. I am sending you an email with the list of books that correlate or align to the Progress program that Sadlier has. But actually, more importantly, we want you to feel comfortable and confident that you can go into your classrooms tomorrow and put some of these ideas that Katie has shared with you into action. And if you have any questions, as Katie has said, contact her, contact me, and we're here to help you. Katie, any last remarks?
No, just thank you everybody for your professional time. I know how precious and valuable it is, and thank you so much for your interest in being here. And I do respond to email. Sometimes it might take me a day or so to do it, but you can get my email at katherinemcknight.com. And those of you who are from Arkansas, I'm going to be at Arkansas Reading Council Convention later in November, right before Thanksgiving. So if any of you are from Arkansas, hopefully I'll get to meet you in person.
Oh, that's terrific. Katie, I want to extend a warm thank you to you. It's always wonderful working with you and having you as our guest speaker for our webinar series. And everyone on the line, thank you for attending. We look forward to having you attend future webinars that we will contact you about, and that hopefully you will share your time with us. So thank you everyone again, and we hope you have a great evening. Bye-bye now.